The American Civil War saw upwards of 300,000 desertions between the Union and Confederate militaries. The Union Army, which boasted approximately 2.5 million men, had about 200,000 deserters. And the Confederate Army, which numbered less than 1 million strong, was affected by an even greater percentage, with over 100,000 men abandoning their units. There are numerous motivations as to why a soldier might attempt to leave. From fear for one's life, a desire to escape harsh conditions, or even just the want to return home to take care of their life and family who have carried on without them. But of course, during war, one of the most significant crimes a serviceman can commit, no matter the reason, is abandoning his post. And this crime has often been punished by death. This is the basis of one of the most infamous ghost stories of Alabama, a romantic tale of a Confederate soldier hanged for suspected desertion after he returned home to the small town of Newton, Alabama, to care for his ailing wife. A man named William Skeeto. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic. William Henry Sketoe was born on June 8, 1818, in South Carolina. He was the son of John Skeeto and one of 8 siblings raised in South Carolina after his father emigrated to the United States from Madrid, Spain. Legend says that William, or as he was more famously known, Bill, arrived in Dale County, Alabama, when he was a boy traveling with his father. However, no records were found of Bill's presence there until he received a land grant in 1852, 10 years after his father's death in South Carolina. While the 1860 census record shows Bill's profession to be a farmer, owning 240 acres of land near Newton, it is commonly believed that his primary vocation was as a circuit rider for the Methodist Church, a minister who served not just one community, but rather many towns and settlements across several states. Sketoe's area of focus was said to be the Wiregrass region, which included parts of southern Georgia, southeastern Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle. And it is very possible that it was these travels that brought him and his wife, Sarah Clemens, to Alabama with their children. Unfortunately, on December 3rd, 1864, William Skeeto was hanged. But to this day, the truth as to why remains a mystery. The legend of Bill Sketoe's hanging has numerous versions, However, the most well-known and widely accepted telling of the tale is found in Catherine Tucker Wyndham's book, 13 Alabama Ghosts and Jeffrey. Wyndham wrote that at the outbreak of the Civil War, William Skeeto, like many men, joined the Confederate Army and served dutifully until the fall of 1864, when he received word that his beloved wife Sarah was seriously ill. Thus, out of concern for his ailing wife and their children, Skeeto vowed to return home to his family. But on the afternoon of December 3rd, 1864, as he crossed the wooden bridge over the Choctawhatchee River, north of Newton, Skeeto was stopped by the town's home guard, a group of men serving as a local militia under the command of the Confederate Army. It is said that he offered up his papers to the men, showing that he was not abandoning the army, but rather had paid for a substitute man to serve in his place so he could return to his distressed family. But the home guard, led by a man named Joseph Brer, refused to believe Skeeto's claim and decided to hang him for deserting the Confederate Army. Brer and his men dragged Skeeto into the nearby woods, where they beat him and forced him to crawl through the sand while they prepared to kill him. Eventually, he was dragged up off the ground and into a waiting buggy. One end of the rope was thrown around the limb of a nearby post oak tree, and the other tied into a noose to be looped around Skeeto's neck. It is said at this time, a friend of Skeeto's happened upon the scene and attempted to stop the lynching, but the home guard would not be swayed from their decision. And after threatening the man's life, Skeeto's friend ran off towards town in search of assistance. But the appearance of Skeeto's friend unsettled the group, who quickly became anxious to get on with the hanging before anyone else could interrupt. Then, when Brer asked if William Skeeto had any last words, he chose to pray. But to the group's dismay, he prayed not for himself, but rather for the forgiveness of the men who were about to kill him. Infuriated, Joseph Brer lashed at the horse hitched to the buggy, and the cart sprang forward, leaving Skeeto dangling from the tree branch. But William Skeeto was not dead. In the home guard's haste to carry out the execution, they failed to take into account Skeeto's physical size. He was a tall man, and his weight bent the oak tree's limb, just enough that as he dangled there, his feet brushed along the ground. George Eccles, an injured veteran of the war and one of Brer's men, was quick to react, grabbing at one of his crutches to dig a hole beneath Skeeto's feet, a hole said to be about 30 inches wide and 8 inches deep. This was the final act to cause William Skeeto's death. The men then left his body to hang from the oak tree until the next morning, when he was cut down and buried in the nearby Mount Carmel Cemetery. The epitaph on his tombstone read, "Gone, but not forgotten." Unfortunately, William Skeeto's death was far from the end of his story. Rumors of Skeeto's ghost being sighted near the place of his murder started almost immediately after his death. Yet more disturbing is that the hole that had been dug beneath his feet quickly became known as the hole which would not stay filled. Catherine Tucker Wyndham wrote,
Almost immediately after the hanging, curious people began visiting the site of the tragedy. As time went by, they observed that the hole dug by the crutch did not fill up as an ordinary hole would have done, and there were whisperings that Sketoe's ghost was returning to the spot to keep the hole clean.
Some claim that it was merely Sketoe's friends who kept the hole clean, particularly a local named Wash Reynolds. But either way, it is this part of the legend, the hole which would not stay filled, that has kept the memory of Bill Skeeto alive to this day. But as is the case for many tales that have been told countless times over the years, history provides a much different type of narrative as to what actually happened to the man who was hanged on December 3rd, 1864. And much of the skepticism concerning this story revolves around the question of whether or not Bill Skeeto actually deserted the Confederate Army, or if he was ever even a part of it in the first place. At the beginning of the war, the Confederacy relied heavily on recruiting, and the majority of its servicemen were volunteers. But the sheer size and overwhelming manpower of the Union put the South at an incredible disadvantage, forcing Southern states to employ all means possible to ensure the size of their military. So on April 16, 1862, the Confederacy passed the first American law of national conscription, declaring that all white males of the Confederate states between the ages of 18 to 35 were members of the Confederate Army for 3 years of service. Then, within a month of the law's enactment, it was pushed even farther, with the addition of all men between 35 to 45 to be pressed into service as well. There were, however, some ways to legally avoid conscription. Those who held specifically identified service-oriented jobs could be allowed exemption. A drafted man could also choose to hire a substitute to serve in his place, or even pay a commutation fee to avoid enlistment. When these laws were enacted in 1862, William Skeeto would have been about 44 years old, and if he hadn't already volunteered for service, he would have therefore been eligible for conscription. But unfortunately, a lack of documentation calls the story of Sketo's military service into question, as he does not appear on any muster rolls and his widow on no pension documents. One possible reason to explain how he may have avoided serving in the military were these loopholes in the conscription laws. If he were in fact a minister, a service-oriented career, Skeeto would have been able to avoid being drafted, allowing him the enviable position of being able to decide whether or not he wanted to join the Confederate Army, as legally he was not required to. But whether this was the case or not, it is extremely likely that Bill Skeeto was never actually in the Army, never even in the position to desert, as legend suggests. As for the paperwork that he is said to have presented upon being questioned by the Newton Home Guard, that is unlikely to be accurate as well. At the time, hiring a man to serve in the military on your behalf was legal and accepted within both the Union and Confederate militaries. However, in early 1864, the Confederacy repealed its substitution laws. Thereby, men in the military could serve only on behalf of themselves and not any other. So when William Skeeto was returning to Newton, Alabama in late 1864, substitution was no longer legal, and the idea of formal paperwork acknowledging his military leave by way of substitution is questionable at best. Some historians and storytellers have also theorized the motive for Sketo's murder was that as a minister, he may have been harboring anti-Confederate sympathies and possibly participated in actions with Union raiders in the area surrounding Newton. Throughout the Civil War, the town of Newton, Alabama, was largely considered lawless. The local courts held no sessions for upwards of 2 years, as many of the men were away fighting in the army. So the nearby pine forest became havens for Confederate deserters and vocal Unionists. And among these Unionists in the forests were groups of men who were known to emerge from the woods and terrorize Newton's residents. It was for this reason that Newton's Home Guard was formed, to protect the area. In parallel to the legend, Joseph Brer was in fact the commander of this unit. Sometimes described as a, quote, Englishman, he had moved to Newton in the 1850s and during the war served as a lieutenant in Company E, 15th Alabama Infantry of the Army of Northern Virginia, which had been recruited out of Dale County. Brer was captured at the Battle of Gettysburg and later exchanged back home, where upon his return, he became the leader of this local unit, which became known as the Buttermilk Rangers. In addition to protecting the town, Brer and his men also served the Confederate conscription department, making it their duty to hunt down and punish deserters. Historian David Williams posits that in light of this, William Skeeto may have been suspected of helping a man named John Ward, who was the local leader of a group of deserters and pro-Union guerrilla fighters. Two months prior to Sketo's death, John Ward and his men ambushed and destroyed a Confederate ammunition transport train, causing at least one Confederate officer to be killed. In response, John Brer and his men executed 2 men by hanging for their alleged collaboration in the attack on the munitions train. It's said that there was a 3rd man to also be hanged, but the action was halted by a Confederate officer, citing a lack of sufficient evidence. Yet Brer seemingly wasn't finished, and it was mere days after the execution of these 2 men when William Skeeto was stopped on the wooden bridge over the Choctawhatchee River. To this day, not one piece of hard evidence has been publicly produced to support Brer's accusation for treason. As for the men who carried out this vicious murder of the Methodist minister, it is said that each who was present died violent, unnatural deaths shortly after. One man was struck by lightning, one found dead in a nearby swamp, and another was killed when a mule ran off with him. George Eccles, the injured man who dug the infamous hole beneath Sketo's feet, was shot and killed in a raid on a local Unionist home. And most notably, Joseph Brer was killed during a thunderstorm when he was knocked from his horse by a tree limb and killed. Some say the tree was a post oak, the same kind of tree from which he had William Skeeto hanged. Today, the site of William Sketo's hanging lies beneath the Alabama Highway 134 bridge over the Choctawhatchee River, which was built in 1979. However, a 1990 flood of the region forced engineers to reinforce the riverbank with tons of rock. And for the first time in over a century, the hole was filled. And this time, for good. In addition, the original bronze marker commemorating the location of the incident was moved to the Newton Museum in the Newton Library. Now, all that remains of the legend of William Sketo's death is a plaque placed nearby at the John Hutto Park in 2006 by both the Newton Historical Society and Sketo's descendants. And it remains there today as a reminder of the tragic death of a man whose story continues to be told almost a century and a half later. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you've been listening to Southern Gothic.
Southern Gothic is an independently released podcast, written and produced by Brandon and Brianne Schexnayder. For special access to members-only content, including access to the series Southern Gothic, The Monsters, visit southerngothicmedia.com today.
Lucky Little Shacks.